From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we're going to be talking about the impact of incoming U.S. sanctions on Iran energy exports, their impacts on Iran, their impacts on energy markets in general, connections with the oil markets in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and so on. And with me to discuss these issues, two colleagues of mine, Alex Vatanka, who is a senior fellow and writes prolifically on Iran here at the Middle East Institute. Alex, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Paul.
And good friend and colleague also, Dr. Jean-Francois Seznec, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute and an adjunct professor at the SIAS School at Johns Hopkins, works and writes extensively on energy issues and the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. Jean-Francois, thanks for being with us.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Alex, let me start with you. How is Tehran preparing for these sanctions that will come into place this weekend or next Monday?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things they're doing, but I think one of the aspects of their sort of reaction to the new sanctions to be imposed from first week of November is to sort of make sure one message comes across very forcefully, certainly for Washington, which is to say, we will be able to overcome these sanctions. You will not be able to bring our oil exports to zero. That's been a consistent message. I don't know how much of this is intended to reassure the Iranian public, because there's an element of panic inside the Iranian public of what is about to happen to us. And I think realistically, the idea that you can bring Iran's oil exports to zero in the short term is unrealistic.
Well, give me a sense. What are the current levels of exports, and what does it look like they might go down to?
So, I mean, at the peak after the nuclear deal was signed back in 2015, I believe they were about to 2.5 million barrels per day. And Jean-Francois knows this better than me, but I think they're about the 2 million now or something like that. They've lost a fair amount. Now, the latest reports from the Iranian parliament in terms of what they need to be able to export to survive talks about 1 million at the $65 to $70 barrel range, which is, that. In other words, what they're saying is we can lose another 50% of our exports and still be able to at least survive in the short term.
Well, Jean-Francois, I mean, you follow the Iranian market as well. Again, to maybe dig down on that question, what does their market look like actually? Their production, their export, who buys it, where are they going?
Well, they produce 4 million, but they only export. They were exporting 2.8 before the sanctions took place. They're down about 2 million, as you mentioned, Alex. And I think they will probably go down much further. I think the sanctions will bite a lot more than the market as a whole was expecting. I was at a conference here in Washington a year ago where people were saying, the total loss will be 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day, maybe 400, and we're already at 700, and the sanctions have not started. So the big surprise has been the Chinese companies have not taken advantage of the situation. In fact, they have not picked up any oil for November, and that could really hurt Iran.
So who are the, let's say, current buyers? I mean, before these sanctions hit, who is currently buying the oil?
Oh, currently Japan, China, of course, and India are the main importers. Korea as well. So the big industrial
all
countries,
in Asia.
Yes,
Pretty much,
in Asia. Well, the Europeans were buying a fair amount, but we know that's going to go away because the European companies have to abide by the U.S. sanctions. But ultimately, so do the others. And the Indian companies already have cut some of their purchases substantially because they themselves do not want to be caught under the U.S. Associated sanctions. So that ultimately that will leave only the small Chinese companies. The big Chinese companies will need to deal in dollars somewhere along the line, so they will stop buying.
They will stay away.
That's right. So
are there any expectations in the market and so on as to what the number Iran will end up with in the sanctions? Is it under 1 million?
No, I think 1 million.
Knows?
I think 1 million is probably as far low as we can expect. But even I think the wishful thinking of the Iranian parliament and the government that they will not be hurt or they can survive at 1 million, That's pretty hard to believe. They
Mm-hmm.
will be really hit hard because that's a lot of money. And
It's a lot of money, and they don't have. I mean, they're not starting from a good place.
no, and they
Yeah.
don't have that much cash reserves on hand. The
Yeah.
Saudis have 500 billion. They could wait things out, but the Iranians don't have that much money.
Well, Alex, let me ask you a little bit about the internal politics of all of this. Obviously, the IRGC is a big, player in the Iranian energy market and exports and so on. You mentioned the parliament. There's the internal politics, messaging to Washington, messaging to their own people. And as maybe you or Jean-Francois mentioned, there's also a bit of a panic in Iran about what's coming. How do you describe the game, the political game, the realities inside Iran over this issue?
I think it's actually pretty tragic when you look at how various interest groups in Iran are using this issue as a way of scoring points against each other for this in this competition for influence within Iranian sort of corridors of power, if you will. I don't get a sense that this is a moment where the nation's going to rally around one figure, one issue. Certainly, Revolutionary Guards people are not talking about being behind President Rouhani. If anything, they're going the opposite direction. They're saying, if you cannot deal with the consequences of these sanctions, get out of the kitchen. Get out. If you can't deal with, the pressure, then let somebody else come to the fore. Now, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, which, as we know, has the ultimate say over any key issue, has made it very clear he doesn't want to hear much more about Rouhani having to leave prematurely. Most likely that means he's going to sit out his second term and his final term till 2021, which might be a sign of some degree of stability. But fundamentally, this is what the Iranian regime suffers from. A number of key constituencies that have power pursue power for their own sake, for the sake
Doing
of
their own thing.
They're doing their own thing. The national interest is sacrificed. What happens to the Iranian economy and ordinary Iranians is sacrificed. And Paul, if I may, one point which relates to foreign policy, one of the countries that we forgot to mention, although Jean-Francois mentioned all of them, but the exception was Turkey. Turkey is a major also a trading partner for Iran in oil and gas. I mentioned that for one reason. The Turks, most likely, if you're sitting in Tehran, are going to use that issue of whether they want waivers from the United States or not as a bargaining chip with the United States. And that goes to a larger issue. A lot of countries are looking at Iran and its relations with the United States as a way of getting things from the United States. So Iran sits in this horrible position where it becomes a bargaining chip and doesn't really necessarily, it's true for the Indians, it's true for the Chinese, it's true for the Russians, it's true for the Turks. And again, that is a sign of the failed Iranian foreign policy.
Well, we'll get to some of the other countries and how they're impacting this. And one of them is Saudi Arabia. And I wanted to ask you, Jean-Francois. I mean, on the one hand, I guess the Iranians are very amused and thrilled with the crisis in Saudi Arabia and the problem between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. But in the energy markets, how might that play out? Is this crisis good for them?
Well, not really. I mean, because ultimately, President Trump has been using this crisis, among other issues, but to beat the Saudis over the head, forcing them to produce more, to announce the bigger production to reduce the prices. Because the president very much would like to have lower prices, especially before the election, and he has obtained that. The prices are substantially lower. Whether or not that will continue in the future, probably. And that makes the U.S. administration look good. And the Saudis need this desperately because they've made a big blunder and now they have to pay for it. So, of course, the Iranians are very happy that they make a big blunder. It makes a fool of a lot of people in Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, from a purely economic standpoint, it ends up to be the Iranians who are going to suffer the most.
If we get to the numbers, so the Saudis, who produce around, 10 million
10 and a half, over 10 and a half now.
And they're promising to go how far?
They can go to 11.
From
right
10 and
now.
a half to 11 right away.
Yes. Theoretically, they could go to 11 and a half maybe 12. It would take a little bit of time. And
Which
if
would
they're-
almost be the loss from the Iranian
Oh yeah,
production.
yeah.
They can
Well,
cover
not
that.
not entirely. I mean,
Yeah.
some of it will have to come from Russia, and of course, the Russians will be very happy to support the Iranian to the hilt, except when it comes to money, where they'll make money like hell selling oil to the world market to replace the Iranian one. So, but the Saudis will produce more, make up some of the losses. Yes.
Well, I'll mention that last week you both participated in an event at MEI on the energy markets and so on. And I think in that event, Jean-Francois or some other panelists mentioned this relationship between Russia and Saudi Arabia on oil issues, that it's OPEC plus Russia.
Absolutely.
So what are the dynamics of that? Is it, a cooperation to keep prices high or to get market share or both?
A little bit of both. It's mostly market share, but it's really market control, I should say, because de facto OPEC does not exist. I mean, there's an organization and whatnot, but there's only one country that has the ability to produce a lot and increase production, and that's Saudi Arabia. The only other country who can do the same thing or say the same thing is Russia, who is not a member of OPEC. So for control of the pricing, whether the price should go up or should go down, which is controlled by the amount of production, only Russia and Saudi Arabia can work together. And in spite of having very little in common from a political standpoint, that's one thing for the past 3 years. They've worked together very well. And even the Saudis are now investing heavily in the Russian oil fields and whatnot. So that's really
Very
a big
interesting.
change. Yeah,
It's
it's
very
really a momentous change. And one could say that OPEC really has no importance nowadays. Today, the importance is this alliance, Russia, Saudi Arabia.
Very interesting. I mean, given that Saudi Arabia is an ally of the U.S. as
Of
well,
course.
and given that Russia is backing Iran and other spheres,
That's right.
that's a very interesting relationship. And Alex, in that seminar last week, you talked a lot about the Iranian-Chinese relationship, and you put it that Iran is relying on China, maybe is being over-reliant and thinking that China will save it from, the impacts of the U.S. sanctions. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, just for a historical perspective, Paul, 20 years ago, Iran's biggest trading partners were almost all in Europe. The biggest one was Germany at the time. That has been overtaken by events. China is by far Iran's biggest trading partner. Something like 1/3 of Iran's overall trade is with one country called China. Now, many people in Iran find that to be troubling because you are becoming too beholden. Now, Iran is obviously not the only country on the planet that's seen a massive increase in trade with China. Case is true for many other countries. Case for the Iranians is it's not just China has grown in terms of being a partner, trading partner for Iran. It's that the role of other partners of the past has shrunk so much.
Yeah.
So if it's 1/3 today, could it go up? How far more can it go? And is it healthy? And it goes back to that fight inside the Iranian regime. There are those people, the hardliners, who really genuinely believe that the East, meaning China principally, is the way forward. Let's forget the West, certainly forget the United States, because if you start making concessions to the West, then first you're going to make concessions to your nuclear program, then something else in Syria, and the list will be ongoing. So philosophically, they want to go east, which is not something that's new. They've done it repeatedly before, and repeatedly they've burned their fingers. I remember a few years ago when Iran was proudly saying, we're able to sell our crude oil to China. Chinese keep buying it. And they were. There's one trouble with that mechanism. The Chinese weren't paying for it. They kept their money in their banks, and they cited U.S. sanctions as a reason. In other words, you can dance around this issue. But fundamentally, Paul, it goes back to the state of Iranian foreign policy, because
the power of U.S. sanctions on China, even.
And how the U.S. continues to be able to mobilize, whether it's by using, a sort of sensitive appeal to countries or using more repressive instruments to get them on board. The fact is U.S. can hurt Iran by getting the rest of the world on its side, and has repeatedly shown that. And only Iran can stop the United States from doing that by readjusting some of its foreign policy behaviors.
Okay. Well, let me ask about, you said go east is sort of a mantra among the right-wingers in Iran. Let's go west for a moment, Jean-Francois. The U.S. is now one of the biggest producers and maybe soon exporters of oil and gas at some future point, no longer dependent in the way it used to be in the 70s and 80s. And as you said, the consumers used to be in the West, the consumers are now in the East. And yet President Trump and the U.S. is still very engaged about, what happens in the Gulf and what happens with Iran and oil. I mean, separate from the geopolitics. Explain a bit how independent is the U.S. and how dependent is it?
Well, I mean, the U.S. is actually already exporting a fair amount of oil, but it also imports a lot. So some refineries need some type of oils and others don't. So net, the U.S. still imports more than it exports, and net it's about 3 million barrels a day that
Net
we're
import,
importing.
yeah.
We're also exporting natural gas in the form of LNG, and that's becoming fairly big. It's still relatively small compared to Qatar, but it's still getting there. The main issue for the U.S., though, that even though it's now a relatively small importer, the problem is that the price of oil is a world price. It's set by various, the production of all the countries of the world. There are only basically two markets for oil, and those markets control the prices. So if all of a sudden there is a cut in production because of Iran or something like that, it may increase the price of oil. That will impact the price of oil in this country. It's not based exactly on the same market or the same index, but they tend to move together. If the oil in London goes up, the oil in New York will also go up, and vice versa.
They're connected. Yeah.
Yes. So it's very important for the U.S. to be able to control the oil routes and to make sure that the political aspects of the production is stable enough to have stable prices. Stability is almost more important than low prices, because this way companies can plan and decide how they're going to produce in the future. So it's vital for the U.S., which is the largest user of oil in the world. We use almost 20 million barrels a day, which is, probably 1/5. It's 1/5 of the world production.
Compared to China, do you know of offhand?
China uses about 10 million barrels a day, and we do 20. So, and China has 1.4 billion people, and we only have a mere 350 million or so. So the U.S. influence is absolutely enormous on these matters. So it's important for the administration to try to control the stability of prices worldwide, in spite of the fact that we're increasing production, and ultimately we could be almost independent from the world market, really. But the fact is the price would still be controlled by the world market. Because
we're part of that market.
We're part of that market. If we were totally self-sufficient in oil, but the prices would be so much lower overseas, then people would bring oil from overseas to replace American oil.
Yeah, you can't get away from it.
No.
Well, in the time remaining, Jean-Francois, I want to dig in a bit on Saudi Arabia. You follow a lot of internal Saudi economic issues in particular. And maybe looking at Aramco was supposed to go, they should have had an IPO, then it was postponed. There seems to be some struggles, and you mentioned this in the seminar last week, between the Ministry of Energy and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the PIF. What do you see going on there in terms of sort of the political economy issues inside Saudi Arabia, separate from the political crisis with the Khashoggi affair and all of that?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Well, there's still an enormous effort to diversify the economy. Now, there were two schools of thought in Saudi Arabia. You had the ones who felt, yes, you must diversify the economy, but we produce cheap carbon molecules, so let's make money from these carbon molecules way downstream from that into very advanced chemicals, and then we'll have a lot of companies take these chemicals and make things and then export them, create jobs, add value to these carbon molecules. And that's really the policy of the Ministry of Energy. Then you have the policy of the Crown Prince and the Public Investment Fund, which is, no, let's try to develop in other fields than that. Let's do technology. Let's invest heavily in technology overseas, bring the technology to Saudi Arabia that will create good jobs for good money.
And separate from the energy sector. Yeah.
Basically separate from the energy sector. And they're trying to do both at this time. but they don't necessarily agree, because one of them, the two sides of this do not necessarily agree, because the technology is starting from absolutely scratch. There's nothing there.
Unproven in a way.
It's unproven. And what do you invest in? What kind of technology you want to bring in? And the Ministry of Energy is not happy because they see that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is not really competent to figure out what it is they should be importing from the United States. Should they be
They're
making...
like playing roulette.
Yes,
in
a
their
little
view.
bit.
Yeah.
And you don't decide overnight, we're going to buy Tesla and make Teslas in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't happen that way. Now, there is possibility.
Is that one of the reasons the IPO was postponed?
Yes.
In your view?
Yes, because
there was too much disagreement.
In my view, there was too much disagreement on how the money would be used. Because a lot of the civil service, which is more old-fashioned, and the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, and so on, really were afraid that by going to these high-tech investments everywhere, you would actually squander the money. And it's better to go a little more slowly, but do things more in depth. And so that's, I think, what is slowing down some of the reforms there right now.
Well, let me end, Alex, perhaps with you. If you looked a few months down the road in Iran, after these sanctions have taken hold and the economy is in poorer shape, Iran's allies, who need a lot of money to stay afloat, between the allies in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, Iraqis, and so on, internal politics in terms of Iran's young people, public opinion. Do you see any sort of decision points or crisis points in 2019 to look for because of these sanctions?
I wish I could. It's impossible to guess what would happen, but this is what we do see. People are very upset in Iran. It's just the younger demographics, for a combination of economic problems they have, lack of social political freedoms that they wish they had, and even the older demographics. I mean, you need to just watch social media from Iran for brief moments every day to see that this is ongoing, and this is a sort of a wave of anger that keeps building up. So this is not going to go away. That said, will sanctions and economic pain imposed on Iran bring this regime to the negotiation table, or bring it down to its knees, create a moment of implosion where the system collapses from within? I don't see signs of that either, for one simple reason, that this is a regime that has basically prepared for the last almost 40 years.
It's been under siege for 40 years,
yes,
sort of.
So they have gone through many, many different chapters of dealing with foreign or domestic pressures, and they have become pretty good at using force. And that's what it is. They're not appealing to the people's sense of nationalism or love for the regime when they say, do this or do the other. They threaten them. It's about force. And people in Iran by now have become so tired of it all, if you will, that, I don't see any imminent signs of a revolution. But then again, nobody saw any imminent signs of revolution.
Or negotiation.
Right. President Trump has put that on the table. I'm willing to talk. But this Iranian regime, for its own reasons, can get itself to that point. But I said this final point. The regime of the Shah in late of 1978 wasn't supposed to collapse overnight either. So you really never know. And that's a thing for Iranian leaders to bear in mind. But they do know what's written on the wall, and that things are not happy right now in Iran.
Alex Vatanka, thank you very much. Senior Fellow on Iran here at the Middle East Institute. Thanks for being with us, Alex.
Thank you, Paul.
And Jean-Francois Seznec, non-resident Senior Fellow here, also Adjunct Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins next door. Jean-Francois, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you to our audience for listening in. Thank you to our colleague Scott Zuki every week for making this podcast happen. And we will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.